Hello, I'm Dale Matchek. I'm the chair of the Econ program here at Northwood University, and welcome to the next presentation at this year's Freedom Seminar. Our next speaker is Star Parker. Star Parker is the founder and president of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, a Washington, D.C. based public policy institute that fights poverty and restores dignity, emphasizing a message of faith, freedom, and personal responsibility. She's a nationally syndicated columnist and hosts a weekly news show, Pure America, that's broadcast on the National Religious Broadcasters Network, the TCT network, and streaming. She comes to her interest in poverty from her own personal experience. Once she found herself as a young woman in the grip of welfare dependency, but had a life-changing experience, and she started a business, began her activism, began consulting with federal and state legislatures about public policy, including the famous Welfare Reform Act that passed in the mid-1990s. Then she founded CURE in 1995 to bring new ideas to policy discussions about how to end government dependency. She holds her bachelor's degree in marketing and international business from Woodbury University and has received many awards, commendations for her work on public policy issues. So please welcome Star Parker.
Oh, thank you. It's very good to be with you. And I'm going to make my presentation from notes. So if I seem to be looking down, it's not that I'm still not with you. It's just very different when we're on screen as opposed to in live audience. I'm going to go through notes because I want to say some very specific things, but I also want to make sure I leave enough time for any questions that may arrive because of my presentation. And if I don't mention something in my presentation that's also of interest to you, as I'm here in Washington, D.C., if I have an answer, I'll give it to you, even if the question is unrelated to my presentation. Thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to talk to you about breaking the cycle of poverty. With so much discussion today on racial equity amidst more criticism of Americans' founding principles, I believe that there's a window of opportunity for us to reassess some of the great society social policy from the 60s with a goal to fix what is broken down for our fellow citizens that are dwelling in our most distressed zip codes. Our nation is in very serious trouble, and the main reason that our nation is in such political and racial and social and economic chaos and challenge today is because the progressive left began a three-part cultural war on America's founding principles during the 20th century and amassed tremendous power to further their agenda. First, they scrubbed our schools from all reference to God in these public schools. Second, they undermined marriage with no-fault divorce laws and with legalized abortion. Third, they established a welfare state through a war on poverty, and the resulting damage of these fundamental changes in American culture has weakened the opportunity for our most distressed and vulnerable to break the cycle of poverty, creating what I called in my second book, Uncle Sam's Plantation, two Americas, which is what I'm to address with you today. Because as all social snapshots and financial forecasts today show us, having a large, chronically poor portion of our population not only creates significant social and economic problems in their communities, but for our entire country, local, state, and federal. You know, I look at demographic and income information at states all across America, and I find the same thing. And I look at this data because I run a center here in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, where we, as you heard in my bio, fight poverty and restore dignity through messages of faith, freedom, and personal responsibility. And some people will ask me, what does that exactly mean? It means that we don't believe that the answers to poverty are here in Washington, D.C., that they lie in freedom and personal responsibility, not in a welfare state. So our job is to get the government out of the charity business and get God back in, get community back in, get individuals back engaged in their lives. I think most of the passion behind me now running a policy institute comes from my own personal experiences inside of the welfare system, 7 years in and out, 3.5 years consistently. I tell people all the time, I just kind of bought the lies of the left. I believe that my problems were someone else's fault. I believe that America was so racist I didn't need to mainstream. And I believe that I was poor because others were wealthy. So when you start buying into those ideas that I was hearing 30, 40 years ago, but that we're also hearing today, you can get lost in your life and begin to live day to day and sometimes choose very destructive behaviors, which was my reality and the reality of so many that are dwelling in our most hard-hit communities. For myself, it was after a Christian conversion that I was able to just change my life. I got back to college, I got a degree, I studied marketing, as you heard in my bio, and then I began a business. When that business was destroyed after the 1992 Los Angeles riots is when I began to focus on social policy. When I began to say, wait a minute, if life can work for me as an individual who's making new and unique choices for my own personal life, why can't it work for others? And I started seeing that there were barriers standing in the way of many others that they are not able to push out and realize their own potential and their dreams. So I wanted those barriers removed. So that's why I started a policy institute, and about 10 years ago moved it from Los Angeles to here in Washington, D.C. So now I look at income data, I look at demographic data, and running a policy institute. I look at poverty rates. I look at these rates by race, by age, by family structure. I look at education rates by race, by age, by family structure. I look at crime rates by race, by age, by family structure. And what I find everywhere, all over the country, regarding those that are most unprepared to mainstream, whether they're urban or rural, whether they're native or suburban, whether they're north, south, east, west, it shows the exact same thing, this data. This data shows that the social and economic challenges facing these communities that are really distressed, that are not able to just allow their citizens to break free, are result of two things. The social and economic challenges facing these communities are the direct result of two things: collapsed ethics and collapsed marriage. And it is this collapse of having a common moral framework as a country and the traditions of generational family that is at core of the cultural war that's raging in our country today. It's not an accident that poor children today are 3 times more likely to have been born out of marriage than was the case before the left declared this war on the principles of Christianity, the virtues of capitalism, and the rule of law that was established in our Constitution, and which those 3 principles which established our country. The left's worldview is rooted in secularism and statism, and their answer to every crisis, every concern, every conflict is to pour government money at it. They've been pouring this government money at every problem since the 60s, and we started seeing this great society. Government healthcare, government schools, government housing, government wage laws, government welfare, government retirement, all of which have exacerbated conditions of despair, causing government dependency and reckless living to spread like cancer in every state comprised in our union. Because as we all know, lack of marriage equals lack of family. Lack of family equals lack of tradition. Lack of tradition equals lack of education. A lack of education equals a lack of a work ethic. And a lack of a work ethic equals lack of vision. And without a vision, people get very lost. So before we can find answers to break the cycle of government dependency and poverty, we've got to think about what happened that got us off course from being this nation that was becoming a free nation under God. How did we get to the point that almost half our citizens today do not believe in our country's founding principles of eternal truths, of limited government, of free markets, of even a pluribus unum, as the discussions we're having today on all of these race questions are coming up to the headlines. We're even getting lost and balkanizing ourselves away from the very concept of a pluribus unum, where many become one. Perhaps the big divide between the two Americas has something to do with government intervention to build this great society. When we start thinking about these two Americas and why it's becoming so much more divided, I think we should go back to looking at what government did during the 60s in building out this great society. The Great Society is a philosophy to move individuals away from their own interests towards the collective interest of the state. a philosophy where individuals look to the government before they look to God to fix everything. And in 1960, 20% of Americans got more from government than they put in. Today, 60% of Americans get more from government than they put in. So what happened? Well, the war on religion that scrubbed our schools of all reference of God, it weakened our public institutions and opened the door for a culture of meaninglessness. The war on marriage through the feminist movement weakened family and opened the door to a culture of materialism. After 2 generations of a sexual revolution, marriage in our country has totally collapsed. In fact, marriage has collapsed around the world, but I'm going to keep my interest focused on what has happened here to divide us into 2 separate and almost equal number Americans. Marriage rates have dropped from 75% of adult population in the 70s to 45% today. For Blacks, adult marriage rates from the 70s have dropped in half to 30% today. Now, what we know is that conjugal marriage is the capstone of all civil society. And as a result of its unraveling, our public square now is in total chaos. Sexual and gender matters are now dividing us and bringing into question the very premise of personal responsibility and the role of the church. What a whole lot of these court cases are about now on religious liberty issues. All sexual behavior is adult behavior, which should be private, not taught in the kindergarten. And therefore, we have now a culture war because some insist that they want to teach other people's children about sexual matters. Abortion has deeply hurt us, bringing into question the very premise of humanity and our 14th Amendment protections. 70 million dead in 48 years should give us all great pause. Third war, that war on poverty, weakened community, and it opened the door to a culture of melancholy. The rules of welfare that I can tell you firsthand, I can tell you through working on welfare reform, and I can tell you even to today as I work here in Washington trying to dismantle the social welfare state, that the rules of welfare were don't work, don't save, don't get married, and the government will take care of you from womb to tomb. We're hearing it even now, the expansion through so-called family acts and family plans that we will just pay you. We will just pay you. We will just pay you. We'll take care of your children. We're going to expand that from K through 12, which has been a disaster in most of our broken communities. And now we want your children at younger ages, and then we want to educate them even through college. We have to be concerned about these rules of big government. The very concept of redistribution of wealth to alleviate poverty has not only violated principles of private property rights. It's an absolute principle of freedom to own land and a gun. But these ideas, this concept of redistribution of wealth, have also violated the scripture. The Bible tells us don't covet. That is the 10th commandment for those that might have some biblical worldview. Covetousness is not an ideal that we should adopt in our society. Paying politicians, electing politicians that can look out at the society and say, you have something that somebody else wants, so I'm going to go and take it from them and give it to another, is frankly theft. And that's the way that we have now subsidized all programs dealing with the poverty in our country. The bigger challenge is that wealth redistribution under the guise of social justice violates the very social structure that one needs as an individual to break out of the cycle of poverty and government dependency. For without a moral code of ethics and a rule of law, poor communities diminish into what one social scientist called a tragedy of the commons. No one owns it, so no one takes care of it. We see it all of the time. And I remember while we were doing welfare reform here in Washington, D.C., it was Senator Phil Gramm at the time who went almost every presentation would say, I've never seen a man wash a rented car. Now, you wash the car you own and you turn the car that you've rented in back dirty and empty of gas if possible. And yet today, far too many Americans are now lost inside of the mindset of government dependency. There is no free America without family, and there is no family without faith. So should every American be free to choose to build traditional family? Well, of course. But we have to recognize that in 2018, the growth of the American population was the lowest it has been in 80 years. The Census Bureau projects that in just 16 years, there will be more Americans over 65 than under 18. And in addition to this stalling growth, The negative impact of the left's agenda on generational family is alarming. The nuclear family, for instance, in 1968, 58% of all family households in the U.S. had their own children under the age of 18 living in that household. Today, that number is 38%. Regarding a single family, in 1968, 13% of American children younger than 18 lived with an unmarried parent. Today, that number is 32%. And many of you have heard how that there is a growing rate of children now that are born outside of marriage. And those numbers in some cases are reaching 72% in our most distressed communities. And without children raised in eternal truths and with biological parents, our future as a nation is in danger. So you may ask me, well, how is that? How are we in danger and why does this matter? Well, one reason it matters is because of child poverty. Today, 24 million U.S. children under 18 are living with an unmarried parent. 2/3 of all poor children in America live in a single-headed household compared to 8% of children living in a married couple household that lives in poverty. So 2/3 of all the poor children in the country are in a single household. But yet only 8% of children living in a married household are in poverty. We should think about this. We should be concerned about poverty amongst children and then at least be able to address the questions of single parent households. We have 400,000 orphans in our foster care system. We all saw with sadness what happens when a foster child is in a community that's broken down and some of the challenges that can come with that when one just most recently died at the hand of a police officer because she was attempting to murder someone right there in front of all of us. We have 3 million children living in government-owned houses. The reality of child poverty impacts all of us because poor children struggle in school and they have tremendous difficulty becoming proficient in math and in reading. And in the case of Black children, for instance, the 2015 NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, it's known as our nation's report card. It's very sad. It saddens me greatly, and it should you as well if you're really concerned about child poverty and if you're really buying into ideas that we have to address questions of racial equity. The math scores in this particular assessment for Black children, 17% of Black fourth graders and 11% of Black eighth graders performed at proficient levels. Now, keep in mind, this is from 2015. When the new data comes out post-COVID and our summer of love last spring, we will see dramatically different numbers. And unfortunately, we're starting to get some of that data in now, and it's not looking well because people that had access to get their children educated amidst the lockdowns went and got that access to educational opportunities for their children, whether they began to homeschool their children, because many of our more healthy communities and where you have a husband married to the mother of the children, one was staying home with those children. But where we see our single parent households and they now have a computer at that house trying to struggle through teaching their child while the teacher is on a computer that she herself or he himself are trying to figure out. This has become a disaster for us. Those that had options took those options, but we have an entire now population that is already behind and now falling even further behind because of the way the educational unions determined that they were going to keep those schools closed and they fought forever to keep parents away from options to let money follow their children to schools that they want or let the money follow their children to other opportunities that were growing during COVID. The reading scores for this Black population of these children, 16% of them at the fourth grade level and 15% of Blacks at the eighth grade level performed at proficient levels. We're starting to see data come in that this also has gotten worse during that last year. We need to focus time and attention on this if we really want to address breaking the cycle of poverty and breaking the cycle of government dependency and, frankly, starting to heal some of these challenges that we've been told about over this last year. The second reason that we should be concerned about the impact of the Great Society social policy on today is because of crime. Bookshelves are sagging with research that demonstrates with crystal clear clarity that unmarried men are often promiscuous men, and promiscuous men are often unproductive men. And unproductive men are more often than not dangerous men. 70% of the youth in our criminal justice system are from single-headed households, and 95% of the men in our federal penitentiaries have no relationship with their dad. This is an area that we must have discussion about during this time of crisis that we're here on a national level talking about police reform. If we're going to reform policing, if we're going to look at what is broken down to where we're seeing more numbers than society likes of young African-American unarmed men dying at the hand of a police officer, then there are a few things that we need to put on the table in those discussions. We need to move away from discussions that are, if you dismantle the police department, everything will be fine. Most of us know that that is not true. In fact, most of us would agree that the opposite is true, that what we need in societies where family, where community, where rule of law has broken down is more policing. So we then have to get to the question of how do we do that? Well, nationalizing it is not a good idea. There are some things we can do on a national level, like reassess this qualified immunity and see if there's a role in policing where they have to have some responsibility and skin in the game. We have to assess how different cities and municipalities negotiate their union contracts with their employees, because what we do know about the nature of union is that it's based on seniority. The unions are based on seniority. So the poor communities get rookies and rebels more often than not. But we also have to address the other side of that question. These young men that are growing up without a dad in the home that will channel their energy to schooling or to sports. And that energy then ends up in a street. So where you have a police officer who's a rookie or a rebel meeting up against this powerful energy that has no discipline behind it. We are now having those discussions as a nation, and that means that we could and should readdress and reassess these policies that came out during the civil rights movement that captured themselves in a great society and expanded the role of government into our poor communities. The third reason I think that is a good time for us to revisit and reassess these policies that were birthed during the 20th century is because of the diminished morale. When you think about the great society of secularism and statism, it has had great cost. When we think about the lawlessness that we saw at the hand of our youth last summer, when everybody else in the country had to be shut down in COVID restrictions, it is time for us to think about the cost, the moral cost, that diminished morality, because we have the costs that are both emotional and economic, and they're extremely high, and they've taken a toll on all of us as neighbors. The federal government now takes 25% of the American economy, and American people are being told by just a few that they still haven't done enough, that now racism is so systemic we have to have a whole new rebirth of a country. We have to dismantle and transform the country that we have. We have to distance ourselves from all of its founding principles and all of its founding fathers so that we can build some expanded utopian great society through government. And half the country is saying, we don't like that plan and we don't want that plan. And therefore, we now have diminished morale as a society, and it's taken a big toll on all of us. It has created an environment where our public square is now a battleground of constant conflict. We're seeing expansions of government in places we never thought it would be, and we're seeing court rulings on every area of our lives that we never thought courts would need to weigh in on. The economic costs. The economic costs are huge. Poverty is big business. The $24 trillion since the war on poverty began in the 60s. The federal government spends $900 billion annually on anti-poverty programs alone. And this has now been expanded after COVID. And as you heard in the president's presentation the other week, he wants more, looking at bringing more of the middle class into what we've already done to our poor class, thinking that they may get better results. We can look into any and every inner city in the country and see what socialism looks like. We don't have to go to Cuba. We don't have to go to Venezuela. We can go to Compton. We can go to Camden. We can go to any and every pocket where we have concentrated poverty through housing policy and see what happens when the federal government controls every aspect of the community and the communal life. Government dependency has seeped into our entire society, and as a result, we are now in tremendous debt. We've reached a dangerous mass of special interests who have too much stake in big government, whether they're employed by it, whether they're collecting benefit from it, or whether their businesses getting favors from it. We have to rethink and reassess, revisiting these programs and see if any of them are worth survival. The emotional cost. We are no longer a free people. We all have masks to prove that one. Well, not everybody has a mask. I think they just changed the rules that if you have a vaccine paperwork, you can walk around without your mask. So you better have your paperwork in one hand and others have to have their mask in another hand, I suppose. I don't know how they plan to do this one. But we're not a free people. We're not a free people when judges get to redefine truth. We're not a free people when politicians can pass laws and have bureaucrats segment us into special interest groups based on our race, based on our gender, based on our incomes, based on our assets, just to further a social philosophy that throughout history has proven to reduce mankind to savagery. What we should have learned from both slavery and Jim Crow is that force is not an American ideal. Our great challenge today, out of control debt, enslavement to government, broken families, not a formula for a great society, not a formula for the American ideal. But there is good news. The good news is that we can change. The good news is that every part of our country that's untouched by government is going great. Where we see freedom, it works. Where we see deregulation, it works. That's why we had such a successful, bountiful time in the last 4 years, the 3 years prior to COVID, because we saw cutting taxes works, deregulating works, ingenuity works. The good news is that we still have 100 million Americans that get up on Sunday morning and ask God to help build their faith. There are 3 major policy changes that we at CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, work toward to help fight poverty and protect freedom. And perhaps you'll join with us, or perhaps you'll think about these ideas as you explore ways that you can get involved in helping break the cycle of poverty and government dependency. The first thing that we know must be done is we need to end legalize abortion. Abortion is not salvation. It is a crime against humanity. So America should not be doing it, nor should we be exporting it around the world. Because in addition to the moral implications of abortion and its mental and medical complications, abortion feeds the narrative of victimhood, as if women have no control over their sexual impulses. Abortion is at root of why our country is having family and cultural collapse today. And as African Americans, they've been targeted and thus have been hit hardest by the secularist messages of the left, the secularism, the statism, and abortion. And in fact, when you think about how they force and push their messaging of abortion into these most vulnerable communities, it has hit very hard the Black community. The average abortion in the Black community is 1,000 a day, 30,000 a month, 400,000 a year, 20 million since Roe v. Wade was legalized in 1973. 20 million more dead at the hand of abortionists than were alive in the 60s to struggle through the civil rights movement. And is it any wonder that our nation's hardest hit communities are drowning in moral madness when you think about the hurt, the pain, the vulnerability that comes from buying a lie to kill your own offspring? Women and men of all races and backgrounds need to take responsibility over their sexual lives, and legal abortion is an impediment to being able to do that. The second thing that we want changed here, in particular in Washington, is to block grant all welfare and anti-poverty policy making back to the states. All the money, all the making of the policy, including health policy, education policy, housing policy. You know, a lot of people are asking about the homeless challenges that we're seeing today, and it's one of the biggest issues that CURE is working on right now, because our government here in Washington under the Barack Obama administration bought the idea that homelessness was a housing problem. So in focusing all in time and attention on and money resources on housing, it collapsed most of our faith-based organizations that knew that if we can help people transition to their purpose and some principles, that they could recover themselves from homelessness. Instead of going that direction, we've competed now as government to push housing first policies that has skyrocketed our homeless situation. When the Barack Obama administration came into power years ago, we were looking at about 200,000 homeless. We were looking at a $2 billion budget. They increased that budget to $4 billion. And then we were looking at increased in those that are homeless to 400,000. And now today we're looking at it over 500,000 across the country in a homeless situation as a result of policy changes. So we want all of these policies as an organization, we want them out of Washington and get them back to the states, because states are where we should be looking for ways to improve ourselves, to remove barriers to flexibility and mobility and prosperity. The poor more than anyone need help to get their children out of government-owned and union-controlled schools. The poor more than anyone need to get themselves off from under these government health care and government housing and government wage laws and government retirement policies. Enough cannot be said about parental choice in education. And K through 12 is the only opportunity that we as a society get to interject ourselves into other people's children's lives. That's why it's critical that we get the K through 12 model right. And the best model is for money to follow children to schools parents want, that are local, that are promoting and insisting on the values of that household so that that child will become a productive adult. And what's fascinating about poor parents, even those that are in very distressed and very reckless life patterns themselves, they want the type of quality education for their children that the Christian schools provide. And in fact, most of our poor communities and the models where we do have any opportunities for school choice, they choose Catholic schools more than even your traditional Protestant schools, because these poor women understand that when men are in the lives of their children, men with collars and Bible in one hand and maybe a paddle in the other, that it teaches moralities and behaviors for their children to not have blood in the street, but to be able to be productive adults. K through 12 is the only place that we as a free society get to direct the culture of our youth. We can't do it through the internet or the entertainment world. We're not China, we're not Iran. We're not to control the free market. But K through 12, where we as a society have decided that in order to be a civil populace, we need to be an educated populace. So we decided we're going to pool our resources to educate other people's children. The government then should not be in the business of education. The same way they should not be in the grocery store business, although we distribute food stamps, they should not be in the business of education. So we need to move up to a model to where parents are back involved in where their children go to school. All states should be thinking about and working on creative experiments and pilot programs to transition our poor from government dependency. And the third and final thing that we should do, that I believe must be done to fix what's broken down in our society, in particular in our most dependent communities, our most broken communities, our most vulnerable communities, is we need to personalize Social Security with Own America accounts. You know, it's fascinating to me as the left is now asking all of these questions about racial equity, but they don't want to help move our society to where people have ownership and freedom. And that's why I believe it's just disingenuous, this whole social justice movement that is determined that there's only one way to fix what's broken down for the most vulnerable, and that is to take from someone that has more. There are important reasons that we should think about personalizing Social Security for poor Americans, and in particular, Black Americans. Per the Federal Reserve, in 2016, the median Black family net worth was $17,600, about 10% of the median white family net worth. 19% of African Americans have zero or negative net worth. And when you're in a hard-hit community, and then you get hit with more distress or despair, and what happened even over COVID, and then the so-called summer of love that followed in most of our most hard-hit communities, that number has gone down dramatically, or gone up dramatically, where we have many now who have no or negative net worth that are in the African American community. There's an old saying in Black America that when America itself gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And that happens in many, many fronts, because this is one of the weaker communities and the most vulnerable communities coming out of the 60s, when the social left decided that they were going to socially experiment on this people group. And so rather than doing what Dr. King said in his speech, to go back in your communities and build, once the Civil Rights Act is signed into law, the people that were in power at the time, that were trying to expand out this great society rooted in ideas of communism and Marxism, decided to bring the poverty ideas to Washington, to bring all of these programs to Washington. 5 years after Dr. King's death, Roe v. Wade was national law, and we started now seeing the gains that were being made in Black communities since the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment were signed into the Constitution. All of those gains through the hardships of the Jim Crow era started evaporating as we went into the 70s, post these new laws of Great Society social engineering. So just as money should follow children to schools that parents want, public policy should allow for retirement funds to be directed to an IRA if that's what the worker wants. Instead of sending your money to the IRS, you should be able to send your money to a personal IRA that you own, that you can transfer, that you can get a better rate of return than the Ponzi scheme that we have going on today called Social Security. Freedom and ownership is key to breaking the cycle of poverty. And the opportunity to build wealth is one of the most amazing benefits of a free society. And it's capitalism that unleashes the economic potential and purpose of a people, of an individual. Capitalism is about building, creating, working, saving, owning. And this is the system that we should maintain in our free society. More in our society must understand that profit is good. Profit is the fuel to create jobs for our children's children and to fund charity for those that have least. Freedom is about taking personal responsibility for our lives. And the folks that desire freedom should not settle for a culture of victimization, victimhood, the critical race theory that's trying to tell them that everybody else is at fault for problems that people have, of this insistence to blame our problems on somebody else. No, we should not settle for a nanny state. We should fight for freedom. We should fight that America continues her journey towards freedom and towards one nation under God. Thank you for allowing me to make my presentation, share a few of my thoughts with you, and I want to open now for any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Star. I can hear the passion in your voice about these issues. I appreciate that passion. I want to start with a question of my own, if you don't mind. It's about the Social Security. With so many unemployed workers among the poor, how would ending Social Security, I shouldn't say ending, privatizing Social Security work? Or is there another option we might have to help build wealth in those communities where a good share of the people don't work?
Well, what we have is two opportunities. One that my organization was fighting for during COVID was, rather than them to pick winners and losers through the type of, I guess you could say, initiatives that were coming out to help people that were now distressed because of the setbacks in their business, was to just give them their tax money back, including their payroll tax. So you're asking me about the people who do not pay payroll tax. Now, if we wanted to, as a society, abide the idea that we are going to allow those that pay the payroll tax, Social Security tax, to start channeling that money from the retirement program owned by the government, because you don't own it. The Supreme Court has ruled twice. It's just a tax that's owned by the government that you cannot transfer to your heirs. If we allowed all of those folks to do that, your question is now, what about the few that have nothing? What about the ones that do not pay into our system because they do not work? Now we're talking about a very small number of our population that we can begin to think through, how do we help them build wealth? Well, there are a few things that we should do. One is we should incentivize work. when you think about what's happened, of course, of late, to where it's more efficient for people to not work than to work, then we need to encourage work. That's what federal welfare reform was about. When we reformed welfare, we said we're putting in work requirements, and only those that absolutely can do nothing will then be left in the system. So we'll have fewer numbers that we have to think about. How do we help them transition to healthy living independent of a social welfare state? So that's the first question we have to ask ourselves, is how do we get them to work? Well, one place that we should consider is to get the unions out of the business of setting wages. Once you start moving around labor law and wage law, you start to see more opportunity for work build. Then the second thing is you can tell that worker, if they will work, that the payroll tax that they are committed to government to pay will no longer be sent to the IRS, but will be put in a personal IRA. That will build incentive for those that are not working today to go to work.
Do you support, or does your organization support the earned income tax credit as an incentive to work, or is that something?
No. No, I don't. We don't buy the idea of redistribution of wealth. In order to pay an earned income tax credit, you have to take the money from someone else. And we've had many discussions in Washington about what is the best tax system, whether it is a progressive tax system, whether it's a flat tax system, whether it's a consumption tax system. What is the best way for the IRS to fill its coffers with other people's money to take care of the things that it should be doing? Well, you have to, before you ask that question, say, what should the government be doing? And if we as a society agree that the government shouldn't be in the charity business, there's a quarter of the budget right there. Once you free up monies for people in their own capacity to invest that money, build the business they may have wanted, put it back into their community, you're going to create jobs. You're going to create resources for the charities that take care of those that are most vulnerable, that really can't figure out what to do with their own lives, and they need help in that. So we have to start thinking one step back before we start saying, okay, should we manipulate around the edges and have a certain earned income? I mean, some of the proposals that are coming out right now are almost laughable if they weren't, some weren't taking them so seriously. Like what you have Senator Romney proposing, that, hey, why don't we just give everybody $1,200 a month for every kid they have? But this is not a good idea to pay people to have children. So what we want to do is say, okay, how do you really rebuild tradition and family and community? You get the government out of individual people's lives and get them back into their own decision making.
Yeah. I'm going to share some questions from our audience members with you now. You mentioned the three problems created by the Great Society, and a lot of the questions have to do with that. So the first question is about marriage itself. Since that is a personal choice, how can you influence the rate of marriage or formation of families?
You stop paying people to not get married. You dismantle the welfare state. And you stop legalized abortion. You stop legalized abortion and you stop paying people to not be married, all of a sudden marriage will reoccur.
And didn't the welfare reform of the mid-1990s have that effect?
The welfare reform in the mid-90s, what the incentives for the states were that, well, there were some demands. You had to have we had work requirements and we had time limits, but we also had restrictions. Your abortion numbers could not go up. And so, yes, there were incentives to save, the states could save money if they met those requirements. Now, when you talk about government manipulation from Washington, paying states to behave and do things we want them to do, that's not exactly the best model, in my opinion. The best model is to leave as much as you can in the pocket of the people that dwell in these states. And we're hearing even now that the Department of Education will give you more money if you put this disastrous critical race theory into your educational systems. This is not the model that's for America. It should start from the bottom up. So local communities should decide what they want in their curriculums. Local communities should be able to decide what kind of building they want around their communities, what kind of businesses they want to attract. And how you do that is through deregulation and detaxation, not sending it to Washington for Washington to then say, hey, if you behave like this, then we'll do this for you. And that was tried. We got admitted after the federal welfare reform. we did have a faith-based component in there with compassionate conservative, to where you could also on a local level work with the charities that work best with people whose lives are in reckless living patterns and or in disarray, that sometimes no fault of their own. But when it came back to Washington under George Bush, through a faith-based initiative, it began to collapse because the ideas of paying people to behave don't work, especially when you're paying them with other people's money. It barely works in families. You give your kid an allowance and say, well, I'll give you an allowance if you clean a room. But this doesn't work as a nation, because you're going to always have somebody that has more, and you're always going to have someone that doesn't feel that it was a fair distribution because they've worked harder than the other one. So what we should do is say, okay, what is the best scenario so that even the one who has limited capacity but can do something to fulfill their own life with meaning, with purpose, and with work, so that they're not on the dependent state, that's done on a local level. So what we have to do in Washington, and what society has to do, is demand that more is not done in Washington and can be done. Any and everything that can be done on a state level should be done. Anything that can be done on a community level should be done.
There's a related question here about Christianity. In a country that embraces freedom of religion, it's a First Amendment protection. How do you square that desire that you have with the Constitution?
Well, it's not a desire that I have. It is even though, yes, I'm a Christian and I'm glad I am, but the principles of Christianity founded this country, because the principles of Christianity are rooted in personal responsibility. The principles of Christianity founded this country because the biblical principles that founded the country, the founders knew that the heart of man is deceitful above all and desperately wicked. So we're going to make a three-part government. So for anyone that tries to pretend that we got a moral code without morality, or the author of morality, they're fooling themselves. You can't just make it up as you go along. So you're either going to have a rule of law rooted in some type of eternal truth, or you're going to have a rule of law based on what the politicians decide that it's going to be today. And that's where we are right now, because the society has become so secularized. We have to, whoever's on first in the political world determines what the new morality is. And that's a challenge for people that don't want to be forced to do things that they don't want to be forced to do. So when you ask yourself, or I guess the question is, how do you build a healthy society without forcing people to be a particular religion? What you do is you take the principles of that religion that are rooted in personal responsibility, and you get the rest of this out of other people's lives. You buy into the idea that the rule of law, your freedoms stop at my nose. So therefore, you don't have a right to go in and educate my children about philosophies that I disagree with. You don't have a right to tell me who I can or cannot hire. You don't have a right, all of these things that we're now seeing government having to interject itself in, when what we should have to do is say, okay, the 10 Commandments already kind of told us what not to do. Why don't we just buy into that, whether we agree with the God behind them or not? But it might be a good idea to say that we should leave our neighbors alone. We shouldn't steal their money. We shouldn't steal their spouses. We shouldn't lie. We shouldn't cheat. Come on, the list is there for us. Otherwise, the list gets very, very long, which is what we're finding today, including we can't even determine whether masks are political or not.
So I think I know your answer to the next question. It's actually the same question related to our schools and our education policy. You specifically pointed out that we got God out of schools as one of the potential root causes of our secularization. So are you proposing that we put religion in the schools, or what is it that you're advocating?
I'm advocating that the government gets out of the education business, that we allow for money to follow children to schools parents want. And what we had was not only attempts of unions to make sure that money never followed children to schools parents want, but we also had an environment to where many of our states, I think 32 states, had what were called Blaine amendments, to where even if you were allowed money to follow children to schools parents want, that they couldn't take that money to a religious school, a Christian school. They could seem to take it to other types of religious schools, but not to Christian schools. Well, last summer, the Supreme Court ruled that it is not unconstitutional for money to follow children to schools parents want, including religious schools. So we've had a major victory there. So the next step is for the different states that had Blaine amendments to go ahead and peel them away and for parents to fight for choice. And we have a wonderful opportunity with COVID that more parents should be doing that, because if they're spending time with their kids and money with their children at home anyway, why shouldn't the money follow? My goodness, some school districts were paying up to $30,000 per child to educate them in a government funded, union controlled environment. Half of that could go with that parent. And maybe that's a better model than what even Romney has in mind to say, well, let's give them $1,500 a month per child. Why don't we just allow the monies that we're already educating their children to stay in their pocket to be able to be utilized for their children in the environment they want? Those that want secular schools will choose secular schools. Those that will choose religious schools will choose religious schools. And the way that we civilize our society, that we all get along, is we stop forcing ourselves to share space. The reason we're having so much conflict in the public square today is because there is an insistence that we're going to force everybody to do whatever my worldview is. And that is not acceptable in America. As I said, we should have learned lessons from both slavery and Jim Crow. These things have been tried before that we see progressives trying today. They want to force people to live the lives that they think that they should live. Force is not an American ideal. So we should not be forcing other people's children to buy into ideas that they do not want. We should not be forcing people to work in spaces that they do not want. We should not be forcing people to pay for things that they do not want.
That is quite a manifesto for government that you just gave. I have another constitutional issue here. Somebody is asking about the Second Amendment, and you did mention guns in your speech. Are you in favor of the Second Amendment? Do you see some of the current bills under consideration eroding the Second Amendment rights?
Yeah, I'm in favor of the Second Amendment. I believe that the Second Amendment protects the First Amendment, and I like the First Amendment. I like freedom of religion. I even like the freedom of the press. What we've had, the reason the press isn't so free and people are complaining about it is because it's been unionized. And so it's just like one voice now. But the non-unionized press is starting to compete now with the unionized press. I like everything about the First Amendment, but you need the Second to protect it. You know, my granddad, never met the man, but I understand he had an edict. He was one generation out of slavery. And he said, you want to stay free? You need two things, property and a gun. And I think that we should study history before we start confiscating people's weapons to find out exactly why did we even have an NRA. Very few appreciate that the reason we have an NRA is because they wanted to allow for the Black community, these newly freed slaves, to be able to participate in our society. And so when the Jim Crow started and the lynching started and this new community who had never had a gun in their lives, there was an organization that said they need to understand that they now, because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, have a constitutional right to bear arms. The main reason that we have a society of freedom is because we have that Second Amendment, because it's to protect us not just from each other, but from our government. A tyrannical government will force its people to do things that it shouldn't do, and it shouldn't in spaces it shouldn't be. And that's not what America was designed to be. It's one of the reasons I believe that the founders put the Second Amendment right after the First Amendment. In order to have these things, you need this protection. And so, yes, I very, very much appreciate it. And what's really interesting to me, we look into some of our more hard-hit communities to where politicians have been able to force their worldview about the Second Amendment to where the people are unarmed. Less than 16% of African Americans even own an arm. Their communities are overrun by the gangsters. The DC crime rate now, the murder rate's up 40%. This is not healthy as a society. And every time the progressive left starts screaming about taking away other people's opportunities to protect themselves and protect their freedom, you're looking at every community that they actually manage, which are gun-free zones, is where we have all of the bigger problems.
Okay, so there's another question here, or a theme here, a couple of questions about abortion. You seem to be very much in favor of choice when it comes to schools, very much in favor of private choice when it comes to retirement funds and wealth accumulation, but against choice when it comes to abortion. How do you explain that?
Because I believe that abortion is murder. I think that we don't get to choose to kill our neighbor, whether that neighbor is next door, or whether that neighbor is in your own personal womb. There are some moral absolutes that we all as a society need to respect. I think that one of the reasons that we have so much disregard for life out of the womb is because we have such disregard for life in the womb, especially in our most hard-hit communities. When you tell a society that humanity doesn't matter and it's your choice to kill it if you want to, based on whatever your personal whims or choices are that day, choice loses its meaning if it doesn't matter what you choose. So now you have young people growing up in a society that tells them it doesn't matter what you choose, and then they have to make choices for their lives as everything in their community is broken. Their family's broken, their neighborhood's broken, their schools are broken, and our moral codes are broken. And so we end up with very reckless and lawless living, which then leads us to a totalitarian state. So yes, at core, abortion, if you read Roe v. Wade and you put it up right next to Dred Scott, but you take the name off of both of them, they read almost verbatim. It's a violation of someone else. And that's one of the things that most people that keep pretending that it's just a matter of choice will not reconcile with. That the only reason that you think that you need an abortion is because you're carrying humanity. You're carrying someone else. Now we're talking two people, and one has rights. That's why you're starting to see all these personhood amendments going up all over the place, to give a constitutional right to life to that unborn, based on the same premise that we saw the arguments of Dred Scott and what we saw leading to the 14th Amendment, to protect the innocent. So yes, I can reconcile being against abortion 100% because I'm against murder 100%, and still at the same time be for choice in education, be at the same time for choice in retirement, the same way that if someone tries to violate me, I can kill them. So, and it's not murder at that point. So yes, I can see the difference, and I hope that in my explanation, whoever asked that question can begin to see the difference as well.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm reading through the questions here. And I actually think that you've covered many of these questions. Now I want to, while we're waiting for new questions, I want to ask you to share a little bit about your personal experience, if you don't mind, because it's very unusual, I think, for a person of your background to share these strong opinions. I'm not sure if they're common in your peer group, were common in your peer group growing up. If you would provide a little bit of background on how you came to these perspectives, that would, I'd really.
Yeah, I think that it does lend weight to why I'm so strong and passionate about having absolute truth in front of us as our guide and aspiring for excellence and looking for those truths on a regular basis. I grew up in a household that didn't buy any kind of truth. In fact, they were buying into things like, I'm okay, you're okay, you do whatever you want to do. It was earlier than where we are right now. I'm 64 years old, so you can imagine back then the rules of law were or morality were just changing, and today they're just absolutely destroyed, which is why we see such high suicide rates and crime rates with our youth. But I've got caught up in all of the lies of the left. I believed everything that we're hearing today. When you don't have any type of moral compass, you can do whatever someone tells you is correct for your life. I bought that whole lie that we're hearing today, that America's so racist, don't mainstream, just get out there and burn, baby, burn. Do it all. And I did. I mean, by 12, I was already involved in criminal activity. By 14, I mean, I was committing some of the stuff that right now, in my book, my first book, I wrote Pimps, Whores, and Welfare Brats. That's my autobiography. And I left a lot of details out because of statutes of limitations I wasn't sure about, but I did talk about armed robbery and the breaking and entering and many of the other lawless acts that I committed that would have landed me in a life of jail, or dead, like most of my friends during that time. But I escalated very quickly into drug activity and sexual activity. I was 4 times in their so-called safe, legal, rare abortion clinic because I bought that same idea that, hey, this is meaningless. It doesn't matter. I'm just choosing. I'm not going to think about the humanity. I don't have to wonder if this is really life, even though we all know that it is, even though we know that the reality is that if I had even carried that first one, I would have another child. I would have been a mom sooner than I became a mom. And it wasn't until after that 4th time that I had a gut instinct just way down deep inside that there's just got to be something wrong with killing your offspring. I mean, you can only lie to yourself long enough before you just maybe might want a different pattern and choices. And I was pregnant again within a very short period of time, and then had that child. And that's what landed me on welfare to live next 3.5 years of my life, watching my life go straight into a dark hole, believing that I was doing just fine. I was living in the subsidized house. I was getting the check, getting the food stamp. Most of my day was hanging out at Venice Beach, roller skating. Most of my nights were leaving that little kid at home saying, I'll be right back. Don't answer the door. Don't answer the phone. She's not even old enough to answer the door or the phone. And I'm hanging out all night. So yes, I understand those that have bought into these ideas. It's one of the reasons that our organization last summer tried to run billboards in some of these communities that were being burned down. We wanted to talk to that 12-year-old and that 14-year-old because I wanted to, particularly because no one talked to me when I was 12 and 14 to tell me any kind of truth. And so I said, okay, here's the billboard. It was the success sequence. Are you tired of poverty? This is what the billboard said. It had a beautiful person on it. One was a girl, one was a boy. Are you tired of poverty? Then finish school, take any job, get married, save and invest, and then give back to your community. And we put these billboards up, and Black Lives Matters went to Clear Channel outdoor and demanded that they take those boards down. And Clear Channel, because they were so afraid of Black Lives Matters, because they were threatening them, threatening their employees, putting their names and numbers on the internet, telling them go get these folks, that they took our billboards. They breached their contract with my organization and took the billboards down. Now, who got hurt the most? That 12-year-old who was crying themselves asleep, wondering, why in the world is my community on fire again? Why is it that everyone's telling me that the police are out to get me and that I will never have a successful life in America? Because that's their messaging. What Black Lives Matters forgot to tell them is that there are more young African-American men in college than there are in jail. What they forgot to tell them is that in 2019, for the first time in the history of the country, we saw more African-Americans make over $75,000 a year than under $25,000 a year. They forgot to tell them that after a legacy and life of slavery and Jim Crow, that America works even for blacks. They forget that we have a great middle class. They forgot to tell them that more than 80% of black community is already in the middle class. When we start thinking about those we need to fix, like you had asked the question about, well, how do we get to the one that's that can't work, that's not working? Well, first of all, we remove all the ones that can, and we remove all the excuses, and we remove all of these folks that pretend that they have a right to manage other people's lives, to shake down businesses into the billions of dollars so that they can further some social experiment. You get rid of all of that rhetoric. You stop painting images of black people that are not true, and you might actually start seeing some racial equity. You might start actually seeing some racial reconciliation and race relationships grow. Most Americans don't buy this lie anyway. Most of us are very diverse in our friendships and our work environments and our neighborhoods. We know that that's not the reality, what we're hearing from Black Lives Matters. We just want to be left alone. We don't want a law built in force to make us do something or agree with something that we know is not true. And that's where we are. But yeah, my own life unraveled by these same lies we hear today. And that's probably what gives me my passion after a Christian conversion, that no more excuses. You own your life. You do your choices, and you have an advocate. That's the beauty of Christianity. I have an advocate to help me through, to make sure that I can believe that I can start again. That's all. That's the competing voice. The real question for society is, do we want two Americas? The real question is, why have so many, especially of our young, white, upper middle class, bought this idea that black youth don't have the same capacity just because they're poor? Is it because they're poor, or is it because they're black? Because if you really believe it's because they're poor, then we need to remove these governmental barriers so that they won't be poor. But I don't believe that it's just about poverty, because if we're just about poverty, then you wouldn't buy into ideas that make more poor, that sink people further into poverty. You would start thinking about reforms that break the cycle of poverty. So that's really a question of these two worldviews that are conflicting. We have a biblical worldview that's conflicting with a secular worldview. The biblical worldview is say, let people be free. And if those that can't and those little numbers, we'll figure that out. This one says, no, there are some people that are just not equal. They don't have the capacity to be like me. So therefore, we need a social welfare state to take care of them. This is offensive. That entire critical race theory and all of this social justice madness is offensive to many, many African Americans in our society. We're American. We don't be thought of and pitied as a Black American that the police are after every day.
Well, some people, and I remember this during the welfare reform debate, would argue that replacing a dependency on a government check with dependency on an employer who's offering you a low wage, perhaps a very demanding job, that's not actually any different.
Well, but it is different, because the difference is when you're free, you have choices. When the government owns you, you have no choices. It was like slavery. I'm telling you, the rules were don't work, don't save, don't get married. Here's where you live. That's it. Here's where your kids go to school. Here's how you retire. Here's how you die. No, actually, when you're dependent on an employer, you actually are in the driver's seat. You have a choice. You don't have to work there. You can negotiate your wage. And frankly, when you have a freer society, that wage goes up. I mean, my goodness, look what happened when there was a vibrancy in our society before COVID. Prices were rising because people had choices. They start to say, oh, wait a minute, why work for you for that little bit? No, the markets drive wages. One of the major reasons that we have stall out in wages at the low end is because government sets the wage at the low end. They force companies to do things that they probably shouldn't be doing anyway. When it's a free society and a free market society, oh, believe me, you're in the driver's seat and you get to determine whether you're going to work for a certain wage or not. You know where you can see a real model of this? Is in the house cleaning business in California. Now, it might be under the table a little bit, but you're not going to find anyone to clean a 3,000 square foot house for under $400. And they can whip through that house in 4 hours. But they determine what they're going to clean your square footage house for. That's the free market. We see it in the hair braiding business. Your hair braider is not going to sit there and say, okay, I'm going to charge you by the hour, because she knows that hour is going to be long, or I'm going to be hurrying her up. No, there's one set price, and certain braids are $600 a head. So yeah, I think what has happened is people think that their lives are not their own, that we're still in a life of slavery. No, if you don't want to work, if you think that wage is too low, then don't work there. Put your talent somewhere else. And if you don't think that you have the capacity to get something else, then start there, take a night job, get a roommate, start saving some money, and build yourself to where you now have more value, that you can work the next run. I remember my first job coming off welfare. I was in the basement of a food distribution company answering telephones, because that's about all the skill I had. I didn't have a resume. Are you kidding me? My resume was, breaking and entering. Yeah, that's a good one. You start where you have to, and then you move yourself up. The beautiful thing about take any job that was so offensive to Black Lives Matters is you just take any job and work harder than the person above you. Not the glass ceiling, the person above you, because then you replace them. Talent rises to the top. That's what employers are looking for. Oh, and they notice it, and they want to keep it. So even if they tell you when you walk in the door that you're only getting $5, that can turn to $50 very rapidly, depending on that individual's attitude. But when you walk in there with an attitude that government will pay me more and I'm not doing what you want me to do and I'm only here to get a check, we see that in every bureaucrat working for the government. And union workers are infested with it as well, because they're guaranteed. When you have life guaranteed, it actually brings wages down, not up. When talent is on the table and it's moving vibrantly, wages go up very rapidly.
I have a question here from Jacob. I think it's a good one about, if you were to get everything you want, every policy reform that you've mentioned, but there's a transition to be had, right? Between where people are now, you would actually leave people in a pretty tough spot, wouldn't you? Would there be some kind of transition, some kind of temporary assistance to get people from one place to the other?
I think the better question would be, or a part of that question should be, in terms of a transition, is there are two things that we would consider doing, and we should probably do at the same time. One is you change housing policy and you allow people to go live what they want. Right now, what's happening is HUD determines where you live. You're out of the question. So we've created ghetto as a result. We're trapped all poor in one community and nothing works. So we have an energy problem. You can't kill energy, so you're either going to have creative energy or destructive energy. And so now the destructive energy is bigger than the creative energy because we've concentrated poverty, and what's driving poverty today is single-headed households, as I pointed out in my presentation. So when you have a whole lot of single women living in a community trying to raise boys and girls, it creates more problem. And number two, though, so you release that. And how do you release that? Well, one temporary solution would be to take that $80 billion that we're spending over there at HUD and just distribute it to the few people that are actually living on HUD. Let them go live anywhere they want to. Let them move wherever they want to. No restrictions at all, even on the person that takes it. That way, if you want to, or your grandma wants to rent a room to them and, single mom with a kid, let her. Well, why not? If she got a voucher worth $1,000, well, that's beautiful. And in fact, she might even decide to move to a little suburb to where everything around her now is healthy, and she's the only one that's living in that environment. So where her neighbors are going to start inviting her to dinner, they're going to have her kid playing with their kids who have dads, and the value systems are going to change. So it would be really more healthy for all of us, not just for that single mom trying to raise a boy, but also for our society, because we adopt the views of the community that we live in. Then the second thing I would do is personalize Social Security very rapidly here, because as I mentioned already, the Black community is flush with cash but has no net worth. You got to build asset. You got to build transferable wealth. We're one generation away from that, but how you speed that along is you allow money to go to IRAs instead of going to the IRS. Now, all of a sudden, people have the capital that they need to open that business that they wanted. They have the resume line to move into a home that they need or that they want, and then it builds from there. When you transfer wealth, the real difference that we're hearing all through all this envy policy of the BLMers and the race equity people that are frankly and told us that they're Marxists and they think that the only way to solve the problems is to destroy the country, is that what they're really looking at is that the white community is 3 generations in America ahead of the Black community or any other ethnic minority. When you have transfer power, of course you're going to have more. When you look at, from my dad, I already told you, it was one generation of poverty. His first house, the government had to buy because he was in the military and they didn't allow Blacks to live on the base at the time. So he had to live in the neighborhood. The neighbors didn't want him in the neighborhood. So the military started buying up the houses. That house, I wouldn't even want to tell you numbers because I know you're taping, allowed me an opportunity once I sold it, once he passed and I sold it, to now build my daughter. My point is, my daughter is not going to be anywhere in the financial situation that my dad was. 1, 2 generations. If we're asking ourselves as a society, how do you encourage for more of that to happen at the same time? You personalize Social Security. Then those communities that we say we're most concerned about will be flush with cash because all of the healthy that are really concerned about those communities because they grew up there will be the ones that will open charity there. But there is a third thing that I do need to mention because I did try to get it in ideas here in Washington when they were talking about the tax reform bill. And they went the direction of the Opportunity Zone initiative that opened up the ability to get a capital gain benefit if you put your business into some of our more distressed zip codes. I think that those owners of property that are in these distressed areas need to be ticketed. They need to be taxed to force them to sell or utilize that property. Because one of the biggest challenges we have to urban despair and blight right now, it needs to be a blight tax because we have that blight because somebody owns a property and they don't live in that community. So all the streets are all messed up and dilapidated, but if you turn up into one corner, one neighborhood to where the people own their property, they have manicured lawns, it might be a little bitty baby house, but it's well kept. Because that's their ownership. It's the difference between ownership and rentership. And so those businesses, that is something that we should consider in local communities, is forcing HUD out of the housing business because they own most of those dilapidated buildings. They need to be forced to sell them so that somebody will come in and utilize that property in a positive way. It's a violation of a principle that one social scientist, James Q. Wilson, called broken windows. It was the concept, the economic concept, broken windows, that then Rudy Giuliani used in New York. One part of that principle, that if you see a broken window and you don't fix it right away, you're going to have a broken door. When you have a broken door, next you have broken street lights. Before you know it, you've got broken community 100% and totally trashed. And that's what's happened in all of our urban core. So one of the other things, so that's a third part, I would first of all allow for housing vouchers. get people out of those communities to where they can now go get some good education for their kids, where they can have a breathing room to where they're not having shootings every single night in their community. I would personalize Social Security so that the healthier part of our ethnic communities will have the capital they need to go into that business, to have transferable opportunities for wealth. And then third, I would make sure that the people that own property in our distressed zip codes that are using it for nothing but a tax write-off should be incentivized to sell it. Let's just say it that way.
Okay. Those are very specific prescriptions. Well, I want to thank you for your passion. Thank you for sharing your diagnosis and your solutions with us this afternoon.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it very much. Star Parker.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I hope someone gained something from what I had to say. Maybe I changed just one mind.